Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. It's just a couple of minutes to noon, so we're just going to wait a bit longer before we get started. So, hello, everyone. My name is Fiona Lewis, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar hosted by Daymac. The Aplastic Anemia Myelodysplasia Association of Canada is a leading funder of research into bone marrow failure diseases in Canada. Our organization supports patients and caregivers across the country who are living with aplastic anemia, myelodysplastic syndromes, and paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. So I'm the patient support liaison for BC and Alberta. And before I introduce our speaker, I just want to familiarize you with some of the features of the webinar platform that we're using. So you should be able to see a control panel on the right side of your screen, and you can click on the small arrow in the orange box to open or close that control panel. And once it's open, you'll see that there is a a question box where you can type in questions or comments for us, or you can also use the chat feature that is shown there as well. Your line will be muted during the presentation, but I will unmute everyone at the end for questions. Sometimes people have audio problems during the webinar, particularly if your internet connection is weak. So if this happens, you can log out and then log back in again and select the option to use the telephone instead of the computer audio. The registration email that we sent you earlier contains information on what numbers to use to call in on your telephone. And it is recommended that you use a headset to avoid any echo or feedback. Also, we will be recording this webinar so that we can post it on our website later. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Sabloff to present today's webinar regarding clinical trials. Dr. Sabloff is an associate professor of medicine, director of the Leukemia Program, co-director of the Ottawa Hospital Hematology Biobank, and a member of the Blood and Marrow Transplant Program at the Ottawa Hospital. He's been working with Cancer Care Ontario on improving the care of patients with acute leukemia across the province. His research interests include refractory acute leukemia. He collaborates with a number of cooperative groups both in Canada and in North America. Locally, he has helped identify a biomarker identifying patients who will be refractory to induction therapy and a drug that can improve the outcome of these patients. So we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. And as I mentioned, you can type them into the chat feature on the right of the screen, and I'll read them out for Dr. Sabloff to answer. So with that, I will turn off my camera and turn it over to him to begin the webinar.
Great. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I have to say, these virtual presentations are a bit weird compared to what we used to do. So have no idea who's watching, and but I have an idea of who's involved. So I'll assume that some of the people here are have some familiarity with clinical trials and studies, and have been participating in some of them, but we'll start from the beginning to get a bit of a background. So, and yeah, so feel free to ask questions along the way, or we can deal with them at the end. So, so we're going to talk about what is a clinical trial and what's involved in participating in clinical trials, and then finally how to find the most up-to-date information about clinical trials, where to find them, and how to go about enrolling in them. So what are clinical trials, and why do we perform these clinical trials? So the current pandemic is a sort of a good illustration of these trials, and has brought them to the forefront. So, in general, a clinical trial is testing a drug, medical device, or treatment to work, and how it works in people. And why do we engage in clinical trials? And basically, we are trying to answer specific scientific questions. And it can be to test ways of preventing disease, detecting disease, diagnosing disease, treating disease. And certainly there are, and so it is important to understand that clinical trials are asking a very specific question and can't answer all of these questions at the same time. There are treatment trials, which most people are familiar with, to test new treatment options. And in general, there are treatment trials, there are diagnostic trials where we test ways to diagnose and in more detail, or screening trials to ways of trying to screen patients who are going to develop disease. There are quality of life trials that are studying either the way people live with the disease, or how they tolerate different treatments and their outcomes, and then of course prevention trials. So there's a whole slew of different types of trials, and I think this is very prominent in the past year. If you haven't heard of some of these phases of trial design, it would be surprising if no one's familiar with any of these phases of trials. So phase 1 trial is a trial where a drug is being used in a small group of patients or people to find the appropriate dose that is tolerated really by that population. So it's a trial where usually we start at a very low dose and increase the dose as patients or people are given the drug, and to what we call the maximum tolerated dose, that to assuming that we will have the best result if we can deliver the highest dose of that drug. And so that is usually determined by the amount that a human can tolerate without making them too sick. Once that dose is identified, then we can move on to phase 2 trials, where we are using that dose in again a small group of people who to get an idea of how well it might work, and particularly some of the side effects that we might expect in a bit of a larger group in people. And then finally, the phase 3 study, which is where we, using that dose and the knowledge that we've gained from the phase 2 study, compare it to a standard of care. And that can be, so usually they're randomized, they can be placebo controlled if there's no adequate standard of care in that, to treat that disease at that time. So for instance, in the current pandemic, the phase 3 clinical trials that we've all been waiting to, that have concluded, and other trials are concluding, are being compared to placebo. So some people are getting the vaccine and some people are not, and that's only ethical or able to be done because there is no vaccine or preventative treatment for the virus at this time. That could change as we have a standard of treatment or prevention in this case. And then usually they're blinded, and so blinding is a term used to let us know that at least the patient may not know what they're getting. So they may be getting the treatment drug, or they may be getting placebo, or they may be getting, if there's a standard of care, if there's a treatment that we're trying to improve upon, then they may be getting that. And so if it's only the patient doesn't know what they're getting, then it's a single blinded study. And if it's double blinded, is where both the patient and the treating team don't know what they're getting, because they can make the treatment look the same. And so those certainly have advantages to try and minimize the influence of the patients and treating team to think that that a patient may or may not be getting a treatment, and those kind of biases can influence the outcome of trials. So the less the team knows about what they're delivering at the time, maybe produce a better result. And we'll touch on it in a few slides, that just because the team or the patient may not know if they're getting the treatment, the experimental treatment or the standard or placebo, there is an oversight committee that does know what everybody's getting. And then phase 4 studies are what we're actually going through now in the pandemic. After the treatment is approved, it then gets delivered to the population in a larger way, and the different health agencies collect data on outcomes from patients that are receiving the treatment over time, to again confirm that the results that the previous studies were showing are continue to be true in the real life situation, which you'll see a little bit is a little bit different than the actual clinical trial design. And just to give you an idea of how complex some of the roadmap to discovering a drug or an idea to delivering it to patients, you can sort of follow the arrows back and forth from the basic science labs, where we collect samples and study those in the test tube, and work our way through to animals, and eventually to humans. And there's a whole infrastructure around that is required to successfully bring a new idea, a new therapy to the clinic. So that just gives you an idea of how complex this can be and why it does take years still to move a new therapy to the clinic. This is a little bit of that in a different way, where information is circulated from the basic science lab to the research lab to the clinic and back and forth to both test the therapies and feedback to the lab in terms of things that may or may not be working. And so there are drugs that are what we call, sometimes you might hear the term a first generation drug, which is a drug which is the first time that this class of drug may be used. It usually followed by what we call second generation therapies, which are if that class is working and looks very promising, then pharmaceutical companies will develop new agents that they try to maintain the target or the goal, and at the same time try and develop the agent in a way that it will have less side effects. And so usually the treatments get better with these subsequent generations of drugs or therapies. So what are the benefits? I mean, some of these might be or maybe obvious, but some of these benefits or the risks and benefits are not always so obvious. So certainly the benefits of participating in clinical trials or running clinical trials it gives us access to promising new, potentially promising new procedures or treatments that are generally not available outside the clinical trial. And I think you always have to emphasize that it's potentially promising, because it is not always so that a new therapy that looks promising both in the test tube or in pre-human models, it doesn't always turn out to be as good as sometimes they are predicted to be. But certainly in today's technology and understanding of moving these drugs through therapies, we're getting better at making sure that when we bring a drug to these phase 3 steps, even the phase 2 step, we know a lot more about them, and that they're likely to at least not cause harm, and usually they show an incremental benefit in what was being done before. So the a procedure or treatment may be more effective than the usual approach. The trial participants. So if you're participating in a trial, you're receiving high quality medical care from the research team, and that's not, and I have to emphasize, that doesn't mean that if you're not in the trial that your care is any less high quality or any less than in the trial. However, trials, as we'll talk in a second, follow very specific protocols that force the team to be very vigilant about at certain time points and collect certain blood tests. And so you get a little bit more attention usually when you're in a clinical trial, because we have to collect samples and meet certain timelines. Certainly the results of the trial are are going to help us to care for patients in the future. Whether the trial is a positive trial or a negative trial or a neutral trial, we learn lots of information from these trials, and especially these phase 3 trials. And again, if you look at the COVID, the current pandemic situation, what's reported in the news is in terms of the efficacy of the vaccines is a small part of the trial, but the most important one that everyone wants to know is how efficacious are the vaccines. But along the course of the trial, the trial, the treating team has been collecting samples and lots of data that are going to be used to further enhance the treatments or understand the treatments, understand people's responses to these vaccines, and hopefully help us to refine them and make them better as we go along. And along those lines, it's participating in trials helps us to learn more about the condition that we're treating, cancer, other conditions, and along the same lines make further advances. So risks are hopefully minimal when we participate in a trial, but there is always a risk to these to being exposed to new therapies that have a limited track record. So like I was saying, the procedure or the drug may not be better than what is currently available. There may be side effects that could be worse than the standard of care. They can be different, and sometimes we find unexpected side effects, and that's why it's important to go through these steps of these phases of the trials to tease those out and to expose the fewest number of people to some of these medications that may have some unpalatable side effects. And along with what we were saying before, usually when you're in a clinical trial, you have more visits to see the medical team, and those are in order to meet some of the criteria of the trial. And but in part, it's because we're trying to learn more about the disease, about the therapy, about the interaction of the therapy and the disease along the way as well. And so in particular in myelodysplasia, some of you may have participated in studies. We unfortunately, one of the only ways to measure the disease is by doing these bone marrow tests. And so inevitably there are more tests or more bone marrow assessments that are done during a trial than we would normally do outside of a trial. And then there can be some costs that people have to incur during a trial. Usually those are, we try and limit those, certainly because people wouldn't want to participate in trials if they had to spend too much money. So usually a lot of the costs are covered in one way or another. So again, what is a clinical trial? And I was alluding to this before. Clinical trials follows a very specific protocol, which is written to meet very strict scientific standards to produce reliable results, while at the same time protecting the participants. And so there's some very specific narrow goals that we are trying to achieve during a trial. There's a strict eligibility criteria. So some people may have experiences where, well, you seem to have the right disease, but you can't get into the study because the study excludes some people with maybe some heart conditions or liver conditions or a variety of factors. Sometimes the trial is only geared for a certain age group, and so there are eligibility criteria that we have to follow. There's a duration of the study. There's specific information that we're, like I said, trying to gather during the study, and built into the study are protections to the participants to minimize any risks of side effects or adverse events during the trial, and to protect their privacy. And so I think those are important aspects of trials that sometimes we don't think too much of, but these are all built into the trials. And of course, the trials are always centered around what we call informed consent. And so that's the consent form that we hand out to patients which is designed to explain the trial as clearly as possible and what's involved in the trial, what tests, what time commitments, what procedures, the treatment, and potentially if there's costs involved. So that should all be in a properly written consent form. And so clinical trials, so in the clinical trial, we're evaluating the safety and efficacy of new treatments in general. And like I was mentioning before, it may compare a new treatment to a standard. It may just be the new treatment. So like a phase 2 study, everybody would be getting the treatment to have a general idea of how well it might work before we move on to compare it in a much larger setting. We may be assessing quality of life of a disease or a treatment. So all very important aspects of these clinical trials. And who's part of the team? Who's part of this health care team? So there's usually a lead physician or scientist or a nurse who's leading the study. There's other physicians and nurses that are assisting in the implementation of the study. Usually statisticians are involved, and there's lots of research staff that, again, can be nurses or clinical trial coordinators, data managers, to help collect the data that is being generated from the study, so that we can, again, use all the information that is being that we have access to through a trial, and certainly guide the participants through the trial in the most orderly way possible, and to make sure that we're meeting all the criteria of the trial. And then there's and this is all overseen by the every institution has an ethics board, which is where the trial is reviewed for the ethical issues that may arise, and particularly the consent form is reviewed there, so that to try and make sure that it meets certain criteria that are relevant to that institution, and is clear to the patients and participants. And one of the things that we always have to do is try and make them shorter, because sometimes they can be quite long, and that doesn't help to participants to get through the information. And then there's this data safety monitoring board. So most of these, certainly these phase 3 studies, often the phase 2 studies, will have this data safety monitoring board, and that's a committee of, could be physicians, researchers, statisticians, other experts. There's a small committee. They're the ones who, they're not involved in the study, in the day-to-day operations of the study. They're involved in overseeing that the conduct of the study is happening in the way it's supposed to, and more importantly is to make sure that the study isn't doing harm. And on one hand, it's not, we're not doing harm. And so if in these phase 3 studies, if you happen to be getting a treatment, experimental therapy new therapy compared to a standard or a placebo, it's possible that the experimental therapy is not as good as what it's being compared to, and in rare cases it can be harmful. And in the past, over the past decade, century, there's a whole history of trials that have not gone as they were thought to go, or in terms of the therapy looked promising, but when we actually did the phase 3 study, it turned out that the treatment was no better, or sometimes rarely more harmful than what was already being done. And so the Status Safety Monitoring Board is there to make sure, to test, not to wait to the end of the study, but to oversee the study at certain time points to make sure that it isn't, again, it's not causing harm. And on the other side, to make sure that, to see if the treatment is so much better than what it's being compared to, that there's no point in enrolling more patients into the study, and we should just stop the study and give the new treatment to everybody. So there's both sides of the study in terms of trying to avoid harm, and also futility in that, again, if the study is showing so much more benefit to the experimental arm, then they have the power to stop the study. They have the power to stop the study if it's causing harm. They have the power to stop the study in the middle at some point, if the experimental treatment is much better. So these have all developed over the years, again, because of there's a whole history of clinical trials that have had their difficulties in all these areas, and so these oversight bodies are all there to help make sure that that the studies run smoothly and patients are well looked after. So I think it's important when you're enrolling in a study of knowing or thinking about what questions would you like to ask. And so it goes back to a lot of these points that we just talked about, to understand what is the purpose of the study, what do the research think of the approach, that who's funding the study. So that sometimes has a influence on how the study is being run. Is it funded by the public monies, or is it funded just by pharmaceutical companies who has reviewed and approved the study? Or how are the study results and safety of the participants being monitored? So we just talked about that. How long is the study going to last, and how long are you expected to participate in the study? And what are along those lines, a question that sometimes not as obvious is, if you're in a study and you happen to be responding well to that medication, some studies may want to observe the results over the year or 2 years. But when the study finishes, it would be good to know that if you're responding to the medication, that just because the study is over, they don't stop you from receiving the medication if it's an ongoing treatment, say. And then, what are my responsibilities if you take part in the study? Usually it's to show up to the appointments and follow the instructions. And again, also importantly, who is going to let you know about the results of the study? And importantly, sometimes, is what if information changes during the study? So it is possible that information, the studies are designed in at one time point, but between the time the study is designed and enrolling patients, new information may influence that study and influence that the treatment, or what is the standard, and so sometimes studies change or have to close because because they're no longer comparing to what is considered standard, or something has surpassed that therapy. So again, risks and possible benefits. So these are a number of, just we can go through these a little more quickly in terms of questions. So you can ask, what are the short-term benefits, long-term benefits? What are the short-term risks and side effects, or the long-term risks and side effects? What other options might be available if I don't, want to enroll in the study? And how do the risks and possible benefits of the trial compare to the other options? So I think that helps you to make a decision about participating in terms of one's own personal questions. What kind of therapies, procedures, tests do you have to undergo? Does the procedure hurt, or what are the side effects to the procedures? How are the tests in the study compared to those you'd have outside of the trial? And like I said, usually in the trial we do more tests and more visits. And how if you're on medications, can you keep taking those medications, or do you have to switch to other medications? Where will your care be carried out, and will there be any charges to you, and how it might affect your daily life, and are there other people that you can talk to? Sometimes there's a number of people already in the study who can tell you what it's been like to be in the study. So there's, again, cost issues, which should be minimized to, most studies will pay for things like parking or travel. And so these are important to think about. So I wanted to just touch on this was one issue, about clinical trials. It's nice to, most people who are coming to this probably are interested in clinical trials, but and keen to participate, but we are always trying to enroll people in trials, and some people have some hesitancy to participate in trials for a variety of reasons, but we don't do a terribly good job of enrolling patients for a variety of reasons. But and again, the pandemic illustrates this a little bit, that about 96 million people have been infected with the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but actually only 4% of all the patients who have been infected have been enrolled in these randomized trials that are being reported, or we're waiting for them to be reported. And it's similar in cancer trials, that especially adults, children, the pediatric side does a much better job of enrolling in clinical trials, but it's still under 10% of our patients that we enroll in a clinical trial. And we also have, it's also noted that there's a lot of underrepresented communities in our trials: African Americans, rural people. There's areas of underserved cancer patients, and so these are missed opportunities to better understand the influence of our therapies on the diverse populations that we serve. There's scientific knowledge to be gained, and develop new therapeutic strategies, and this competes with a lot of these studies that are not quite as powerful as these clinical trials. And so again, during the pandemic, we heard a lot about some of these medications like hydroxychloroquine, some other ones that, statins. There's a drug called tocilizumab, which had some excitement, but when they are, in this case, these are drugs that are available, and they may be given to a number of patients, and then reported in terms of they did or didn't work, or they seemed to work, and but the patients were not enrolled in a prospective way under the strict guidelines of a clinical trial. That met, rather they were collected, and retrospectively the data was collected, and that's less powerful and sometimes can lead to false understandings. And then when you try and move that to a proper clinical trial, it becomes clear that it's not as useful or effective as it seemed to be. And this is just a table saying much of the same, but a little bit more detail about the different problems that we have to try and overcome in terms of enrolling a variety of patients and demographic groups, communities, and then there are physician and researcher barriers to running these clinical trials. Sometimes where some researchers may not be aware of certain trial or some of the background knowledge, or sometimes it's some teams are reluctant to enroll in a trial because they are very familiar with the therapies that they use, and they're a little bit reluctant because they're afraid that the new therapy may not be, either it may not be as good, or it may, they're unfamiliar with the side effects, and so that can produce some hesitation. And then there is this infrastructure, and in order to run certain clinical trials, you have to have a certain infrastructure at your institution. There has to be enough funds to run the trial, and so there's a variety of issues that still plague the broadening of some of these clinical trials. And then along those lines, this is unfortunate that there's this. What I didn't even know this was this high. I know there's some trials that never reach their targets, but they had apparently there's about 86% of the clinical trials that don't reach their recruitment targets. So you have to recruit a certain number of people into a study to reach a level of confidence that what you're reporting is true, and about 20% close early, and this can be because there's not enough funds, or for and sometimes just that either the patients or the treating team are a little less enthusiastic about the trial. And this, and even at large centers, so some of the major centers in the U.S., for instance, can only get up to about 23% of patients. So this is one from Boston, where they have a quite strong group of healthcare providers in myelodysplasia, and they found that only 23% of their patients were enrolled in clinical trials. So getting closer to what does the landscape look like? These are the distribution of clinical trials throughout the world. So, but we're not going to go all over the world. So how do you find one that's right for you? One is to talk to your doctor, because your doctor should have an idea, understanding your disease. Understanding the disease is important. So this is how myelodysplasia breaks down through in the latest WHO classification. We can look at the disease by risk group. So we can divide them into low or high risk and untreated or after failing a treatment. And then there are targeted therapies that are coming potentially, and then there's an issue of iron overload, specifically in myelodysplasia. So that's one way of looking at them. This is the whenever you get diagnosed with myelodysplasia, the team will go through this scoring system to put you in a lower risk group or a higher risk group. And so the original version of this was this international prognostic scoring system that looks at the number of blasts and the karyotype or the genetic profile of the disease, and the number of blood counts that are low, and then this can be put into 4 different risk groups: a low, intermediate 1, or intermediate 2, or high. And there's a this is just adding in transfusion dependence, or sorry, this is if you're in the low, intermediate 2, or high, and sort of the score and how many people are transfusion dependent and the rate of transforming to acute myeloid leukemia in that group. So you can see the low group has takes about almost 10 years to transform, whereas the high group is much shorter, and the survival. There's a revised version of it, which is a little bit more detailed, and divides the group into 5 risk groups. But essentially, there's still a lower. We still use the top 3 are in the lower risk, and the bottom 2 are in the higher risk group. And that's just a graphical version of the survival, and of course we're trying to improve these survivals with our therapies. And this is just a schematic of one of it's a bit of a simpler approach to how do we treat the disease. And so you have low blood counts that eventually are diagnosed as myelodysplasia, and we think about allogeneic transplantation in certain patients, but most patients are not eligible, and so we have these lower risk and higher risk disease, and these are some of the therapies that we think about. Some are available and some are not right now. Some are in clinical trials. We're going to talk about that in a second. So where do you find a clinical trial? So there are a number of databases that are easy to find, and so I've listed them in these next few slides. This is one. The clinicaltrials.gov is sort of the main one where all studies are registered, and so if it exists, it should be registered on this site, and it's just working through the boxes to try and narrow it down. Sometimes you just put in, say, myelodysplasia, you may get 1,000 studies, but you can narrow it down with other terms. The NIH has a website that tells you their trials plus the ones it connects to the previous clinicaltrials.gov website. Health Canada has a website. There's a database which is called Clinical Trials Ontario, where not all of the studies in Ontario are being run through, but they have a number there. And again, they're going to be the same ones that are going to be on the clinicaltrials.gov, but there'll be a smaller number because they're more local. There's another trials group, the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, which runs a number of studies. So this is just what this group is running, and then there's the MDS Foundation, which is also has some tools to find clinical trials. So some of these are easier to use than others. So it's but they should have overlapping. They should find overlapping studies. Daymac has a nice website with a lot of information, and also lists some of the current studies. They also have this neat tool where it asks you a number of questions, and then you can and so through those questions it narrows down the list of trials. So different ways of trying to find one. In Ottawa we have, and so in Ottawa here so in terms of local trials, in Ottawa we have again, if you divide them into like lower risk or higher risk groups, we actually have 2 in the lower risk group. And so in the lower risk group, we're trying to usually minimize the number of transfusions by giving a medication to try and push the bone marrow to make more hemoglobin. And so there's a study called the COMMAND study, which is a new drug called luspatercept versus Eprex, which a number of people are on. And if you don't respond to Eprex, then there's this other study called IMerge, which is this new drug called imetelstat, which is to look at it, and it's not, so the first one's a phase 3 study. The second one is not a phase 3 study because they failed and there's nothing to compare it to. At this time, we don't have a higher risk. We don't have a trial for higher risk. We just had one, and the pandemic has put a bit of a forces to stop for a period of time. So we're just sort of ramping up again. And then some of you may know or may have been part of this study that Dr. Christou, who was in our group, was running a Canadian myelodysplastic syndrome priority setting partnership, which was a number of surveys which are been useful and look pretty neat, and we're getting close to using that information to help to deliver better care to the population. Toronto has a number, because they have a bigger population, they can run a number of studies that we can't, and so they have a variety of phase 1 and 2 studies, 3 studies, and just listed a few that they, that are some that are looking at agents again in a phase 1 study where they're looking to see how well they're tolerated. Some are looking, again, here, this is a dose escalation of a phase 1 study of this new drug, CFI 400945. There are some targeted studies that are starting to come out. So one is if you have this IDH2 mutation, there are some inhibitors that have been developed that may be effective at treating that disease. And here's another phase 1/2 study. And then there are a few other trials. Most of these are actually in the US, but it's just to give you an idea that there's a number of studies that are all that are around. Now, having said that, I think maybe, yeah, the last study. Having said that, people wonder about. I'm not trying to encourage people to run all over the world to go look for a study that's good for you. I think that most important is your team should be trying to have studies available in that area, and usually it's studies that they think are going to impact on the the population the most. So so a lot of the ability to enroll in studies happens to be where you are, or your geography, because it is certainly easier to enroll in studies that are close to you than far away. And there aren't too many studies that we would suggest that people go far away to try and get into, because they do make sort of incremental benefits. And one of the things that we've learned in a number of the studies in myelodysplasia are that some of the agents that look promising individually, when they were combined with so this standard of this in a lot of these studies is azacitidine, which some of you may be familiar with, but when it's combined with other agents, it doesn't always produce the additive or synergistic effect that we might hope. So I think that I will stop there, and I hope that addressed a lot of the questions people might have. So I'll wait to hear if there's any questions.
Great, thank you so much for that information-packed presentation. I'll just unmute everybody, and we'll see if anybody wants to ask a question, or you can also, as I said, type it into the question box there. And Just turn my webcam on, and maybe Dr. Sabloff, you'd like to do the same.
I can.
Hello.
Hi, yes.
I have a question. Could you please tell me more about the PNH clinical trial, phase 3?
You're talking about, did you say the IDH one?
Yeah, PNH clinical trial, phase 3, in the last page in your presentation.
Yep.
Could you please tell more information about that clinical trial?
Sorry, which one?
PNH.
Oh, the PNH. I see.
Yeah, phase 3
Yes.
PNH study. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Yes. So that's it. Yes. So we didn't talk about PNH too much, and it's a very rare disease, as you probably know. The standard is right for patients that have PNH. For those of you who don't know, is this drug called eculizumab, which is given, which is an IV that's given every 2 weeks forever, as long as it's working. So there are a number of new agents that are being tested. There's 6 or 7 agents that target that disease from different places, or trying to replace eculizumab. They do the same thing, but they don't have to be given every 2 weeks. They may be less often, every 4 weeks, or So I think that there's a lot of interest in trying to replace that medication, which happens to be one of the most expensive therapies across all diseases. But apart from that, I think it's, if you're interested in it, I think this one is, I'm trying to remember, I can't remember where it's being. It might be in New York, but we have been offered to run some trials in PNH, but we can't do it because we don't have enough patients that would make it possible for us to run such a trial. So these are some of the barriers I was talking about earlier, about that if we ran trials where we could only enroll like 1 or 2 people in the trial, we would not be able to run our trials unit, and we wouldn't have any trials for anybody. So these are some of the challenges, but you can certainly look that study up on one of those websites, and it'll give you all the information you need about the study and what it does, what's involved, and number to call for the coordinator to talk to.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
And Dr. Sabloff, are you able to share your presentation with AMAC, and then we could post it on our website?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, then people can see all the resources you provided. Anybody else with a question? I just had one for you. I was just wondering, if someone is in a clinical trial, does their GP or physician get information about how they're doing, or is it up to the patient to sort of share that with their doctor?
No, your doctor should be informed about that you're participating in the trial, and they should get the regular updates that you would normally get through being seen in clinic. And your GP is I like to try and remind our patients that even though they see us a lot with some of their these conditions, we don't want to cut out the GPs, the family doctors, who are so important in managing your care in addition to what we're trying to do. So they need to be involved too.
Great, thank you. Just checking here. One last call for questions. Okay, I think we're good with the questions then. Thank you again, Sabloff, for the time today and sharing this information with us. I just want to let everybody else on the call know that our next national webinar is on Saturday, February 20th from 1 to 2:30 Eastern Time. And that whole webinar will be devoted to a question and answer session regarding COVID-19 vaccines. So probably of interest to a lot of you out there. And we do have many other webinars coming up, so please check our website to register for any of them and find out more about them. So thanks again, everyone, for your time, and I hope you have a good afternoon or evening.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.